Hi, Steve here. I thought today I'd do something a little different than I normally do. And this is totally unscripted. What I want to do is I want to get into a study about Romans chapter 13, because I know there are a lot of believers in this world who have listened to teaching that's just simply wrong and unscriptural. So what does it mean when Paul, the Apostle Paul, told us in Romans 13 to obey the government? What does that mean? Because right now we're living in a time when we know that this government is basically doing everything against the will of the people, but not only that, it's against the will of God. So what does the Bible have to say about that? Let's get into Romans 13. I want to start in chapter 12, cover a couple verses right there, and then I've got some other verses that'll give you a little bit more insight into what Romans 13 really means. So let's take a look at the Bible together and these scriptures that will help you to understand exactly what the Apostle Paul was saying. I want to make the point here that he starts out, and in Romans, he is speaking to Christians. Okay, so he's not speaking to people in the world, people that don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ. He's talking to believers, people who believe in Jesus Christ, who've been born again. So let's start out in chapter 12, starting in verse 2, and then we'll go from there. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove, get that, prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Notice here he's talking about the will of God. You need to prove what you do, what's acceptable, and what the will of God is. Now let's go to chapter 12, verse 9. Let's look at the 9th verse here. He says, let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. Cling to what is good. The word abhor here means regard with horror or loathing. Detest. Feel excessive repugnance. I think that's pretty clear. Abhor what is evil. So when we see what's evil that's going on, Paul tells us we should detest it. We should hate it. It should be repugnant to us. Now let's go to chapter 12, verse 18. In 18, he says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Now notice this, he doesn't say, be at peace with all men. Be in unity with all men. It doesn't matter what they do or what they say. He said, if possible. Based on what? Based on verse 2, prove what is the will of God, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. What's right? Let's keep that in mind as we go into chapter 13, which is the whole obey the government. Take note. Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. This word authority doesn't just mean whoever the governor or whoever the president is. It means higher powers. Authority in this comes from the King James, the original Greek meaning, to mean higher powers. That's authority, higher powers. Now I'm going to touch on a few key verses here in chapter 13 of Romans. So I am going to jump around, but I'm not going to skip any of the main key points. Let every person be in subjection, or subject yourself to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. In other words, the real higher powers or the real authority is established by God, not men. Therefore, he who resists authority or power, the higher powers, has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. Listen to this, verse 3. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Remember, higher powers. Do what is good and you'll have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. For good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it doesn't bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil. The one who practices evil. Wherefore it's necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Let's just think about that verse for a minute. Just think about this for a minute. What does it say rulers are? Rulers aren't those who claim to be the president. Rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. And then verse 7, render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So I think it's pretty clear here that what Paul is talking about is those authorities, those higher powers who are directed and established by God. Do we have rulers on this earth that are evil, that are bringing in lawlessness, that are doing things totally apart from the will of God? Of course. Are we to obey them? For all of you who are shaking your head, yeah, we're supposed to obey everybody who's in authority. That's not what you should have just got out of this. Let's go back to verse 2 in chapter 12. What did Paul say? And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove, P-R-O-V-E, prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Now let's look together at some other verses that will help to solidify and prove what I'm telling you. Let's look in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 16. For those who guide this people are leading them astray, and those who are guided by them are brought to confusion. God is talking about evil rulers or so-called leaders. And this is what he said through the prophet Isaiah to the people of Israel. Let's look at what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 15, verses 12 through 14. It says, the disciples came to him and said, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard what you said to them? And Jesus said to the disciples, every plant which my heavenly Father did not plant shall be rooted up. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if a blind man guides a blind man, both will fall into the pit. Did you get that? You see, God plants people, and God puts people in certain positions of authority, but the devil also puts people in positions sometimes who are so-called leaders. What does it say in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 8? If you see oppression of the poor and denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at the sight, for one official watches over another official, and there are higher officials over them. And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, the Apostle Paul said, starting in verse 3, right above that, and even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God, little g, the God of this world, has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. And then, if you look in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, we see what Peter said to the leaders of that day when they told them, we gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name, and now you've filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Verse 29, but Peter said, and the apostles answered them back and said, we must obey God rather than men. In other words, when some leaders or some so-called rulers are telling you to do something that God has told you not to do, or they're trying to get you not to do something that God has told you to do, you choose to obey God. It's that simple. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 12 and 13, I know that there's nothing better, Solomon says, for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is a gift of God. Do you see what this world system, this new world order is doing? Trying to take away work from men. Solomon says it's a gift of God. So who would try to take away or steal a gift from God from you? I think you know the answer to that. And then finally, we'll look at Revelation chapter 20, verse 10. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone. There the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. The point is, the devil deceives them. Even those so-called leaders are deceived, and that everyone underneath them is deceived. Now, let's not forget Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenlies. This is where the real battle, the real spiritual battle, is being waged and fought. The world forces of this darkness, that's who we really fight against. Those are the real enemies of our souls, not the flesh and blood. So it's up to us as believers to enter into the battle against them. I hope this helps you to understand better. Just like the Apostle Paul told us here in Romans, after he tells us to love each other and to love all men, he says, never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. And then verse 18, if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men, if possible. Which means there comes a time when it's not possible because they are going against the will of God. And we can't participate in that. We can't be in a world system that goes against the will of God. So if you're a believer, you must understand these things, and you must be willing to stand against them. And be at peace with all men, as much as is possible. But when they cross the line that obviously is going against the will of God, we're called to say no. We're called to stand against it. I hope this helps. Think about it.